The Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine has been key to Britain's incredibly successful vaccine rollout. We're all in a much better place because of it. However, today the UK medical authorities have changed the advice when it comes to the use of the Oxford vaccine. The Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation have recommended that due to an association with rare blood clots, alternative vaccines should be offered to under 30s. Where does this leave our vaccine rollout, and how should we judge our own personal risks? We'll be speaking to one of the country's leading experts on vaccines. And throughout the show, I'm joined by Dalia Gebrial. How's it going?
Hi, Michael. How are you doing?
Very well. I've been glued to the COVID press conferences today. All very interesting.
Not thrilling.
Areas could
Who
seem,
needs a social life?
Well, we're not allowed to have one at the moment anyway. We, of course, have a host of other guests on tonight's show, more than usual, in fact, today. We'll speak to Dave Ward about the poll in Hartlepool, the CWU commissioned, which has got under the collar of a fair few Blairite MPs. And we'll talk to a Deliveroo driver who is on strike today, and to a Momentum co-chair as we exclusively reveal the result of their membership ballot on policy priorities. Very exciting. As ever, do share the show link, tweet on the hashtag Tysky Sour, and send your super chats under the YouTube stream. Now, following concerns about its connection to rare blood clots, the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation have announced new advice for the use of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. When an alternative is available, they have judged its use will no longer be recommended for those under the age of 30. At a press conference this afternoon, Dr. June Rain, head of the UK Medicines Regulator, laid out the new evidence that informed this decision.
The benefits of the COVID-19 vaccine AstraZeneca against COVID-19 and its associated risks, hospitalisation and death, continues to outweigh the risks for the vast majority of people. Our review has reinforced that the risk of this rare suspected side effect remains extremely small. By the 31st of March, over 20 million doses having been given, we have had 79 case reports up to and including that date, 31st of March. All 79 cases occurred after the first dose. Of these 79 cases, 19 people have sadly died. These cases occurred in 51 women and 28 men, aged from 18 to 79 years. And from these reports, the risk of this type of rare blood clot is about 4 people in a million who receive the vaccine. 3 out of the 19 were under 30 years. 14 of the 19 were of the cerebral venous sinus thrombosis with low platelets, and 5 were other kinds of thrombosis in major veins. The balance of benefits and risks is very favourable for older people, but it is more finely balanced for the younger people. And we at the MHRA are advising that this evolving evidence should be taken into account when considering how the vaccine is used.
So key there, this condition is very rare, and for almost everyone, risk of getting seriously ill from COVID outweighs by a considerable degree the risk of getting seriously ill from the AstraZeneca vaccine. However, the balance of risk does shift as we move down the age brackets. This was the key graphic, the key evidence that was displayed at that press conference. So we can get this up. This is weighing up the risks of taking the AstraZeneca vaccine versus the risks of not taking it, if that means being liable to catch COVID-19 over the following 16 weeks. Now, this shows with the levels of COVID as they were in March, that's why it's saying low exposure risk, 14.1 people between 60 and 69 would be expected to go into ICU out of 100,000. That's over a 16-week period with COVID, of course. Now, that can be contrasted to only 0.2 people out of 100,000 that we'd expect to have a serious adverse reaction to the vaccine. You can see very, very clear those people should take the vaccine. They should take hundreds of the vaccine. I mean, that's not my medical advice, but you can see that it's overwhelming. But once we get to people between 20 and 29 with COVID at levels they were in March, again, we'd expect only 0.8 people out of 100,000 to end up in ICU with COVID-19, while 1.1% of people, sorry, not 1.1% of people, 1.1 person out of 100,000 could have a serious negative reaction to the vaccine. So the risk ratio shifts as the age group in the population shifts. Obviously, this is the risk ratio if you have COVID levels at a relatively low level. This is what that was what they were in March. This changes if we get to higher levels of coronavirus. So they also showed us how this balance would work out if we had slightly higher levels of coronavirus. So this is the rates we had in February this year. You can see then at all age groups, actually, it makes sense to take the AstraZeneca vaccine, but we have lower levels of COVID than that. And if we had really high levels of coronavirus, so the highest we've had in this country at the peak of the second COVID wave, it really makes sense for people in every age group to get the COVID vaccine. So a very small chance of a serious harm, but because actually at this point in time, if you are in your 20s, for example, and we have the rates of COVID that we currently do, your risk of going to ICU with coronavirus is also very, very low. That's how they're making this decision. Now, how will this change affect the overall rollout of the vaccination drive? We also heard from Deputy Chief Medical Officer Jonathan Van Tam at the press briefing today, and that's what he touched upon. And his advice was, or his statement was actually fairly reassuring.
This is a change in clinical advice for the under 30s. It will require some changes in the way that the National Health Service operationalises the vaccine rollout programme. But I have spoken to my colleagues in the NHS in some detail this morning, and I am assured that actually, because of our supply situation in relation to alternative vaccines, the effect on the timing of our overall programme should be zero or negligible. That, of course, is contingent upon getting the supplies that we expect to get of the alternative vaccines, which are the Pfizer vaccine currently in use and the Moderna vaccine that we hope to bring into deployment from mid-April in England.
So some reassurance there from Jonathan Van Tam. He would have been pleased to be able to also deliver the good news as well as the bad news today, that the first of the UK's Moderna vaccines were deployed this morning in Wales. He's saying they won't be in England until the middle of the month. So was this the right decision? Why have we restricted the use of the AZ vaccine so much later than our European neighbours? And what should young people who've already received the AstraZeneca vaccine make of today's news? To find out, I spoke to Deenan Pillay, Professor of Virology at UCL and member of Independent Sage. I started by asking Deenan what he made of today's change of advice from the JCVI.
What we've heard today seems to me is a very sensible response of the UK regulatory organisation and then the policy part of that, the JCVI, as a response to the information that they're getting, that there does seem to be this rare association with the AstraZeneca vaccine. We've got to remember that really the uncertainty to date has been whether, in fact, this constellation of this disease, this low platelets with clotting, was actually likely to be associated with the vaccine, or was rather random events that may happen all the time and irrelevant of the vaccine. And I think the important bit of information has come out today, both from MHRA, but also the European Medicines Agency, is the evidence is starting to show the likely causality. In other words, the vaccine is the cause of this. And that is why the MHRA have had to deal with this and come out with the JCVI with a new policy.
We haven't been rolling out vaccines to under 30s on a mass scale yet, but there will be lots of people in their 20s who will have had the AstraZeneca vaccine. Especially women might be concerned because it seems, at least on initial estimations, that this affects women more. What would you suggest? How would you reassure? What would you advise a woman in her 20s who has been vaccinated recently with the AstraZeneca vaccine?
Well, first of all, just to dissect that a little bit, what became clear in the press conference today, and Munir Pir Mohammed, who's the head of the Commission on Human Medicines, outlined this, is that because more young women than men have had the vaccines, because of course this is the young people have been vaccinated mainly because they're care workers and healthcare workers, and there are more women in those situations. It is not surprising that more women have appeared to get this syndrome, whereas actually on a vaccine to vaccine level, there's no difference in between men and women. So I think that was an important message that comes out, and is a reassurance, therefore, that it's not a predilection for women. There does seem to be a higher risk in young people, although even that was apparently, less clear. But how the decision was framed was within the risk benefit analysis, is that even if there's only a small increased risk in young people, the fact that young people are far less likely to be hospitalized and get into intensive care, then that was a reason for the advice. So to some extent, that is reassuring to young people and young women. It's rather in the context of what their risk of COVID will be.
I was going to get up the slide of the risk ratios, because this was sort of really the core of the press conference, I think, explaining their decisions. And we can get this up now. This is for 100,000 people with a low exposure risk. So we showed a number of examples. If there were higher levels of COVID, obviously the risk ratios would change. So this showed that if you're between 20 and 29, your risk of serious harm from a vaccine, or from the AstraZeneca vaccine, is 1.1 out of 100,000, whereas your risk of going to ICU within 16 weeks for catching COVID is only 0.8 out of 100,000. So they're saying it's only in that 20 to 29 group where there is a bigger risk of the vaccine than going to ICU. For every other age group, you can see there the ratio changes. So if you're between 30 and 39, your risk of going to ICU is 2.7 out of 100,000, and your risk of an adverse reaction from the vaccine is 0.8 out of 100,000. Now, this all, I think it was a good press conference that made lots of sense to me in terms of how that decision is being made. At the same time, a couple of things stood out to me in terms of how people should make their decisions. So one is so the age brackets are quite broad. So I'm 31, for example. So I can see that between people who are between 30 and 39, the risk of getting COVID over the next 16 weeks is higher than the risk of taking the vaccine. But could the crossover be at a less arbitrary age than 30? I'm presumably at more of a risk of clots and less of a risk of COVID than someone who's 39. And second, what's happening here is they're saying what's being compared is 16 weeks of not being vaccinated or taking the AstraZeneca vaccine. But what if that's not the choice? What if when I'm offered a vaccine, I might think, well, I could get the AstraZeneca one tomorrow, or I might be offered the Moderna one in a month's time. So, I mean, I can see why they simplify it to explain the decision they've made, but it's quite difficult for people to judge how their personalized risk should be assessed when there are actually quite a lot of unknowns. When will I be offered a different vaccine, for example? How would you advise people to deal with those unknowns?
Yeah, those are really good questions. I think taking your first point to start with, which is about the absolute risk according to specific age, and lucky you're a young man of 31, and where do you fit? The problem is within the UK, there's been 79 of these cases of this clotting disorder amongst 20 million vaccinees. And of course, if you start to really then try and ascribe risk to each year of age, it becomes very spurious and less meaningful. And so that is the reason why there's been, there's this broadening of age categories. That's the first thing. But the second point you make is an important one. Of where does this? We're not comparing vaccine and no vaccine. We're comparing AstraZeneca to other vaccines, and I think that is reasonable. That is reasonable. Of course, we don't know necessarily what long-term impact will be and side effects of other vaccines that have not been rolled out. So the Moderna vaccine, for instance, it's been rolled out in the US and we're looking there. But we've got to remember it takes many millions, in this case, many millions of doses before these signals become clear. And of course, different countries have different sort of populations. And secondly, we've got to be mindful of the supply chain. And I think we've already learned to our cost that following a government aspiration for a vaccine rollout, without taking into consideration that there may be hiccups all the way along. And that's not just political contractual arrangements, that's also glitches in manufacturing. So to some extent, there's a pragmatism that we need to take on the basis that any vaccine is better than no vaccine. And of course, that includes delaying getting vaccine until your vaccine of choice becomes available. So I think it's quite a reasonable approach that has been taken in terms of encouraging continuation along this route. The point was also made with regard to whether those who've had their first AstraZeneca vaccine should receive their second. And in fact, the advice was very much that yes, you should receive your second dose. But I note that I think in Germany, the announcement just been made that if you've had your first AstraZeneca vaccine, if you're under 60, I think, then your second vaccine should be of a different sort. Now, of course, again, there's arguments both ways for that. On the one hand, just in terms of the pathogenesis, the cause of this clotting problem, if it indeed is an immune response that the vaccine somehow generates against platelets, which sort of makes this happen, then you would imagine that would happen after the first dose rather than waiting for a second dose. But equally, when we think about mixing and matching of vaccines, those trials are going on now, but we just don't have the data to give any indication of that giving one dose of one vaccine followed with another dose of a different vaccine is going to yield the same benefit in terms of protection from COVID than two doses of the same vaccine. And until we have those data, I think it was probably erring on the side of sensibleness for the government, for the MHRA to advise, and Jonathan Van Tam to advise, get your second dose of the same vaccine.
Finally, I want your perspective on, I suppose, the timing of this decision. And especially I'm thinking that, Norway, Germany, there were other countries in Europe who suspended this vaccine for younger populations a long time ago. At that point in time, there were lots of people in this country who were saying, oh, they're being ridiculous. This is all for political reasons. Our regulators have now decided or recognized that these risks were real, that there was a causal relation. Do you think the fact that we have come to this decision a bit later than anyone else is potentially because of, it's not normally how vaccine nationalism is thought of, but this government obviously have a lot invested in this vaccine being seen to be a success. And so do you think they are setting the bar higher for what would be a reason to stop the rollout than other countries are? And could that have cost lives?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think let's separate these into two. First of all, is an approach to intervening in a vaccine rollout before one has a good degree of certainty that a side effect is caused by the vaccine. And I know that the EMA and the same, and obviously coordinated press conferences with MHRA and EMA, both announced using pretty much similar language that on the balance of probabilities, it's now likely that the vaccine is the cause of this side effect. So that's waited until now, and that's had to wait until, in the UK, we've had 79 cases of this particular syndrome, and I think in Europe it's been more like 150 cases for 34 million doses compared to 79 cases for 20 million doses here. So it's needed to wait until those data are there to give that indication. And I think it's stopping a vaccine before that is clear is always difficult, particularly in the context of vaccine hesitancy and so forth. But separate to that, I say, and I say that because I listen to the MHRA and the Commission on Human Medicines, and I myself sit on one of the expert advisory groups for the CHM and MHRA with regard to therapies rather than vaccines, and I know these are run extremely well. They take a large amount of scientific advice, and there's very little political, if any. I've never seen any political interference in the decision making. So I think the scientific decision making remains sound, and it by contrast to some of the other decision making the UK government has made during the pandemic. But the second thing is that more geopolitical context that you talk about. Clearly, AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine has had hiccups along the way compared to the other, compared to, say, Moderna and Pfizer vaccine. There was, of course, the dose mess up in the trials, which made it very complicated to decipher. There was the trials that were stopped because of a potential side effects, neurological side effects, although it took some time before it was clear that the oversight committee of the trial had decided that wasn't a reason to stop the trials. They were started again. And of course, there's been the recent debacle in the US, where the Data Safety Monitoring Board of the US-based trial disagreed with the press release given by the company, and that caused some hiccups. So there's clearly been something around the AstraZeneca vaccine that's not gone well in terms, and that may just be a communications issue, and it may be a different part of the company that is, rather than the scientists that are involved with that. And of course, there's been this underlying, we now understand, this fraught issue of contractual arrangements between countries and AstraZeneca. So all of those things may very well have contributed to different European countries having a stance against AstraZeneca. Of course, they would do that in the context of the other supply chains that they have, the degree of vaccine hesitancy, and of course their own internal political dynamics. So I think for this, I wouldn't necessarily blame the UK government and for this apparent lateness in which the MHRA has come to the table. I think more they've come to the table when there's something to say that is useful, that is being messaged in a way that I think will minimise the harmful effects on the rollout. Although, of course, this may contribute to some more hesitancy.
That was Deenan Pillay, Professor of Virology at UCL and member of Independent SAGE. Now, one thing I didn't ask Deenan about, but which I think it's important to get across, is what the symptoms look out for when it does come to these blood clots. Now, obviously, these are incredibly rare. I don't think there is any reason for anyone to be worried about this. It's just that the risks of people who are young anyway, the risk from COVID are so low. We've been through this. But if you were to be concerned about these clots and you had a vaccine, the European Medicines Agency today released their advice of what to look out for. And again, I presume it's the case that if you have these symptoms, it's still very unlikely you've had a clot, but you should seek medical advice. This is from the EMA website. They say patients should seek medical assistance immediately if they have the following symptoms. That's after taking the AZ vaccine: shortness of breath, chest pain, swelling in your leg, persistent abdominal, that's your belly pain, neurological symptoms including severe and persistent headaches or blurred vision, or tiny blood spots under the skin beyond the site of the injection. So that's what to look out for. If you were to be concerned, you'd be suffering from this very, very rare condition. Now, Dalia, I think you're in your 20s. You're lucky enough to be in your 20s. I'm just past the limit. Are you disappointed you might have to wait a little longer for a Moderna or Pfizer vaccine, or are you relieved that the decision about the AZ vaccine has essentially been taken out of your hands now?
Yes, I am clinging on to dear life for my 20s. I'm turned 28 a couple of weeks ago. In a sense, both. I mean, I'm obviously disappointed that there might be a delay. I'm also glad that the decision has been taken out of my hands. But I've been thinking a lot about, if the AstraZeneca vaccine was offered to me today, and especially if there wasn't an alternative, or if it was offered to me, like, today, i.e., several months before I would be offered it for my age group. And I think overall, I probably would. And the reason is, ultimately, the question is the potential for a serious side effect both more likely and more severe than the condition that is being treated or that is being prevented? And when you look at the graph that we showed earlier, that kind of tips very slightly in the direction for people in my age bracket. And, whilst I would argue that, and I would argue that whilst the condition that I'm preventing, which is coronavirus, if you look at the, most serious effects of that being admission to the ICU, it represents a very low risk to me. But I guess the overall kind of public health of, having lower transmission feels like that is a risk that is not factored in that table. That is a risk I would still consider. And also, like a lot of the data with COVID, I think that the way that we categorize serious cases of COVID is actually quite narrow. Like, obviously, being admitted to the ICU represents a really serious case of coronavirus. But I know plenty of people my age who were actually never admitted to the ICU, but are still suffering from the very debilitating effects of long COVID 6 months plus later, after they were infected. And, we still don't know the long-term effects of COVID on people's bodies. And so that kind of risk isn't registered in that ICU admissions figure, but it still represents harm that I really want to avoid. And not to mention the sort of mental and physical health impact of us continuously having to be in lockdowns. And, obviously the data sort of shows that this isn't a concocted risk, but we also know that the risk is kind of comparable to other things that we take for granted as being, part of our lives. So, taking a flight, contracting COVID, is also a risk factor for blood clots, or being on the contraceptive pill, which a lot of women have been talking about on Twitter today. The risk for the pill of getting a blood clot is 0.3 to 1% over a 10-year period. Now, there's an argument to be made, there that women are not made aware of these risks before taking the pill, and that, that risk still exists because, the pill hasn't really developed that much or advanced for several years because of lack of research, because women are kind of expected to absorb the casualty of maintaining broader public reproductive health. So you could argue that, the contraceptive pill isn't really the gold standard for like public health consent and risk. So we shouldn't really compare them because it's sort of we shouldn't be doing a sort of race to the bottom. But overall, I think that, juggling all of those things, putting things into a bit of perspective, and also considering the other risks of COVID that I would consider serious and that I really would like to avoid that are not captured in that ICU figure, I would still accept the AstraZeneca vaccine. And I think it's really important that, considering all of that, those who are under 30 who have gotten the AstraZeneca vaccine, because they have underlying conditions or because they're carers, really should not panic. And I really hope that this doesn't, for example, reduce the uptake of the second dose in particular, especially that we know that the risks are actually much more associated with the first dose than the second dose as well.
No, I mean, I think all super important points. I think my feeling on this is basically, I do kind of, I don't really trust the government, but I do trust the JCVI and the MHRA. So when I get my text, I'll do what you tell me to do, essentially, when it comes to things like this. Let's go to a comment. FP with a $9.99 donation says, I work in social care and got my second vaccine today, in brackets, Pfizer BioNTech use. You smug person. So here's a celebratory donation. Keep up the great work. I don't really mean you work in social care and you've donated to us. All of our respect to you, and congratulations if you've received either the Pfizer BioNTech or the AstraZeneca vaccine, because these are remarkable pieces of technology. And as Dalia says, it's not just your own risk you're reducing by getting the vaccine, it's also the risk of society at large. So these are incredibly complicated issues. If you are enjoying tonight's show, do hit the like button. It helps us in the algorithm. Now, the 6th of May will be Keir Starmer's first big electoral test as Labour leader. Commentators will be looking out for whether there are signs of the start of a recovery in Scotland, whether Labour can remain dominant in elections to the Welsh Assembly, and whether the party will go forwards or backwards across England's councils. However, perhaps because Starmer has spent so much energy relentlessly focusing on winning back MPs in the Red Wall, the loudest chatter within Labour circles has been about the by-election that will be held on that day in Hartlepool, where constituents will vote in a replacement for the former Labour MP Mike Hill. Now, that chatter went into overdrive on Tuesday when Survation released the first constituency and only constituency-based polling in Hartlepool. We can get up the results here. So Survation have projected that the Tories will in fact gain the seat from the Labour Party, winning 49% to Labour's 42%. They also projected the brand new Northern Independence Party would come in third, which is quite an achievement, seeing as, I mean, they mainly exist on Twitter. They do have a great candidate, Thelma Walker, who's knocking on doors, but most people think of them at this point as kind of a Twitter phenomenon. So to get 2% would be impressive if that is borne out in fact. And they also asked about the favourability of the different leaders. As we've discussed, it's not looking great for Keir Starmer at the moment. So Boris Johnson there, 49% favourable compared to 30% unfavourable. Keir Starmer only 24% favourable compared to 38% unfavourable. Now that's obviously the people in the constituency who were asked. They're not national favourability ratings, they're local favourability ratings. Now the poll was commissioned by the Communication Workers Union, and their General Secretary, Dave Ward, joins me now. Now, Dave, welcome to the show.
Hi, Michael.
I'm going to go through some of the policy questions which the poll asked, because I know this is close to the CWU's heart, the issues about broadband, etc. But first of all, I want to talk about the pushback you got for commissioning this poll from certain Labour MPs. This is what Bren Bradshaw, this is how he responded to the poll. So he tweeted, "Hi, Dave Ward. How about helping on the Labour doorstep in Hartlepool and elsewhere instead of spending CWU members' money on a dodgy-looking, unweighted poll with leading questions and using it to undermine Keir Starmer and Labour?" That was followed up by this from Toby Perkins, Shadow Minister for Apprentices and Lifelong Learning. Toby Perkins wrote, "Instead of spending his members' money running tiny polls to undermine Labour campaign, Dave Ward could more usefully get himself up to Hartlepool. A lot more than 42% of voters I've met are voting for Paul Williams." That's not really how the Labour doorstep works. You normally knock on people who you're expecting to vote Labour. But Dave, I want to know, what do you say? How would you respond to Ben and Toby?
Yeah, I mean, I think you saw our response in our tweets last night that sort of really said they're irrelevant in this debate if that's their view. I think it's a very shallow response from those MPs. I guess it's the start of a coordinated response from some on the right in the party. And I think what it tells me is that they're still blind to the real reasons why they're not connecting with working class communities, and the fact that they would rather attack not us in that sense. I mean, this was carried out by Survation, one of the most well-respected polling companies in the country. I think it just demonstrates how off the pace they are. But to me personally, I mean, they're an irrelevance in the debate. I mean, the CWU, Michael, we commissioned the poll for a number of really important reasons where we thought it was right to make this intervention. Firstly, the CW is a union where we've worked really hard to connect our industrial and political agendas. So it was important to us to test some policies that were around in the general election that Labour then supported. But these are policies that support our members' jobs. So, as you said, things like free broadband, renationalisation of Royal Mail. I have to say, I was quite taken aback by the scale of the support for free broadband and the difference between how that was seen in this particular poll compared to what a lot of critics on the right of Labour, who were criticising Jeremy and John McDonnell for coming up with that policy, which we were part of developing. So I thought that was really interesting, and therefore, it helps us understand what we need to do to connect with our members' jobs and in supporting the industries that they work in. The second reason we do it is the CW is a union that strongly believes that it's time for the trade union movement to harness our collective strength and to really change some of the imbalances of power and wealth that exist, that we can do. Unions can make change happen on the ground. So there was a strong message from us that we wanted to reconnect with working class communities as a trade union movement. We wanted to understand what was happening. And then thirdly, the poll was clearly that we're unhappy with the direction that Labour are taking. We think that Labour are genuinely in danger of becoming an irrelevance. And, you know, my feeling for some time has been that there's no pathway to victory for the Labour Party without a radical platform that changes the inequalities, that challenges that balance of power and wealth, you know, in the world of work, in the economy, and in wider society. And for me, the poll showed that without those policies, you know, a Labour Party that spent the last year obsessing with telling everybody what Jeremy Corbyn, that they're not Jeremy Corbyn. Rightly, it seems to us that people are saying, well, who are you then? And I think there's a message there for Labour that if it wants to win seats like Hartlepool, it now needs to go back to setting out a bold agenda for the future.
I want to get up some of those poll results. As you say, they were quite striking. So first of all, let's look at what people said in terms of their priority being investing more in public services or paying off the country's deficit. Now, 67% when asked that question chose investing in more public services. So they're a clear rejection of austerity, although to be fair, most parties are talking along those lines. Now, there's been quite a turnaround there. There was also, as you mentioned, overwhelming support for Royal Mail nationalisation. And then the real headline result, the real surprising result for many people was on broadband, as you say. So you can see here, 69% of people supported having a policy of providing free broadband internet to all UK homes and businesses by 2030. Now, Dave, my question for you, because I mean, some people have responded, as we've seen, by saying, "Oh, this is an unweighted poll. It's nonsense. People don't actually want free broadband." The more, I suppose, subtle and sophisticated critique is to say that yes, we all knew that people like nice things. The reason why Labour going into an election promising all of these things was a problem was because it sort of fed into a narrative that Labour just offer nice things and you can't really trust them to deliver them, or they're offering so many nice things that will end up in loads of debt. So whilst the public might say, "Oh, I'd love free broadband if the Tories gave it to me, but if Labour give it to me, that would seem a bit, I'd be a bit suspicious there." What do you make of that critique?
Well, first of all, it wasn't an unweighted poll, so it was done exactly in the way that Survation would do any poll, and we actually saw the unweighted results, and then they're weighted at that point, and they go through all the same processes that they do with any poll. So that did then come back towards a more narrow result, actually, in terms of whether they would be supporting Labour or the Tories. The critique, I think what's interesting about it is it's quite a relatively short period of time since that policy was ridiculed by a lot of people, including, you know, many people in the Labour Party. But actually, I think what's happened is that during the pandemic, I think people have realised the importance of broadband, the importance of that in tackling inequality, how it keeps people connected. And I think everybody recognises that unless you've got, you know, full fibre broadband connected across the whole of the country, you know, that without that, it's a key part of your infrastructure to rebuild the economy. And because there's been lots of discussions about rebuilding the economy, I think people have just realised that these are essential things. More importantly, I think there's a willingness to recognise there that the state should intervene in funding and investing in free broadband. So for me, in some ways, it was a justification of the work that we've done with John McDonnell leading into the last general election. And I would say that, you know, John and his team were ahead of the game with this policy. Boris Johnson, I think, has recognised that a year on more than what Labour have. And, you know, so it's a wake-up call for Labour to get back to a radical policy agenda and to set that out as part of its election offering.
I think that's a really important point, actually. You know, if you ask most people, who do you think is more likely to now offer free broadband in the next general election, I think it probably would be Boris Johnson. I want to ask you, because we're talking about Hartlepool, the other big takeaway from that poll was that in third place was the Northern Independence Party. I want to go to a statement they released in response to them being shown to be in third. So they say, a political party that was set up by strangers over Twitter and WhatsApp 5 months ago is now polling higher than the Liberal Democrats and Brexit Party Reform UK. We've not even started our campaign. We've spent nothing on this election, yet we are already beating established Westminster parties. The Labour Party is a spent force in British politics. They are not a fit opposition to the Tories. Now, Dave, in a way, you seem to share some of their analysis. The Labour Party is becoming irrelevant. They're not providing proper opposition to the Tories. Are you in any way tempted by this new? You might call it a very online party, but they're polling in third. What's your opinion on the Northern Independence Party?
Well, I haven't really formed an opinion on them other than I did see the guy who's the leader. Is his name Proudfoot? Was he on your show? I think I saw a clip.
Yeah, Philip Proudfoot. He was on the show with Aaron.
I thought he was pretty good, to be honest with you. I thought he was talking on a more sort of radical platform than what I hear from Labour. So again, a reason for Labour to watch out. But look, I mean, there's a general consensus, I think, building that people are moving towards more separatism. And they seem to be supporting more political parties that are closely aligned to where they are, what their issues are. So I think there's lessons for Labour in that. For me, the big takeaway in all of this is, and this is kind of where the CWU is at the moment politically, I don't want us as a union to get engaged in a debate about disaffiliation because I don't really think that takes us anywhere. But equally, I'm not prepared to, see Labour use the union movement like a bank where it can withdraw money at the time of elections and not represent the policies that we feel that we need in this country, that our members would support. So, Labour should never get something for nothing from the trade union movement. I'm a very strong supporter, Michael, of the trade union movement showing the way here for Labour. And I think we're due to talk in a couple of weeks' time about this new deal for working people and why I think it's important that the trade union movement, whether you're affiliated to the Labour Party or not, that we are willing to step up and take on some of these companies, take on whole sectors of the economy, to tackle insecure employment, to tackle the imbalance of power in the world of work, in the way that the economy is shaped. That's our job. We have to do that. And what this poll was about for me, it just, again, says to me that we are the people that can connect with working class communities. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to develop that. We're going to diversify the way that we spend our political money. I mean, the other interesting thing, which we haven't touched on, is my team have been looking at this during the course of the day. And it was really interesting to see how many CW members went back at people like Ben Bradshaw, almost saying to him, don't tell us how our union spends their political money, because they're putting it to good use. And I think that's a warning sign for Labour, not to treat trade unions disrespectfully. And I have to say, it feels in the last year that they've got more distant from the trade union movement and from engaging with us. We're not a fringe movement. We're a powerful movement. And I think we've got a really good chance of bridging, a lot of the divides that exist in society and uniting working class people. So, that's our strategy. That's what we're going to do. Whatever people like Ben Bradshaw say.
Dave Ward, I know there's lots of people that watch this show who think, I'm a Labour member, I'm inside the party, but I feel completely, sick and lonely and alienated in here. I think most of those watching you will be, glad that you're also in the party fighting their corner. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing and for coming on the show tonight to speak about
No
it.
problem, Michael. Speak to you soon.
Cheers. If you are enjoying tonight's show, please do go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month, because we want to build up Novara Media to be powerful like the trade union movement, so we can also be pressuring Labour or whoever to adopt policies that might actually benefit ordinary people. Now, Deliveroo, the app-based delivery service, has had a rough few days. Last week, the company's long-awaited first day on the London Stock Exchange was labelled the worst IPO in London's history, as the value of the company fell by 26% in a matter of hours. Now, that tumble in share price was blamed on poor timing of the IPO, short sellers attacking the firm, and a complex two-tiered share structure. But concerns were also raised that Deliveroo's business model was based on an unsustainable form of exploitation. The Bureau of Investigative Journalists recently calculated that a third of riders were paid below the equivalent of the minimum wage by Deliveroo. So they write, our analysis of thousands of invoices from more than 300 riders over the past year show that 1 in 3 made on average less than £8.72, the national minimum wage for those over 25 for their overall time per session in the app. Some earned even less. A cyclist in Yorkshire was logged in for 180 hours and was paid the equivalent of £2 per hour. This is perfectly legal because riders are treated by Deliveroo as being self-employed. Now, as it stands, that exploitation might be legal, but that doesn't mean Deliveroo riders are willing to accept it lying down, and that might be what's worrying the shareholders. Now, many of those riders went on strike today. That was to coincide with the start of unrestricted trading of Deliveroo shares on the London Stock Exchange. These were scenes from central London. To discuss the strike and protests around the country, I spoke earlier today to Ethan Bradley. Ethan is the secretary of the Couriers Division of the IWGB. That's the union who organised the strike, and he also works as a rider for Deliveroo. Now, I started by asking Ethan what were the issues that motivated him to take strike action.
So I've been a Deliveroo rider myself for 3 years. We have watched our pay decrease, particularly through the pandemic, as orders have dried up. Meanwhile, Deliveroo have doubled their number of riders from 25,000 to 50,000, so they claim. And as a result, because we're gig economy workers, we're paid per drop, per order, not per hour. We've watched our wages plummet to the point where we're not even making national minimum wage, let alone the living wage. And this is before costs as well. So you've got to pay out your own pocket, upkeeping your vehicle, your bike, your car, insurance, if you drive, fuel as well, and all these other unexpected costs, like costs of doing business that Deliveroo don't compensate you for. So this pushes your wage down and down. So pay is the main reason we're doing this, but we're also trying to seek rights, because like we are classed as contractors, not workers, so we're not entitled to sick pay, no holiday pay, no minimum wage guarantee. And this is a loophole that Deliveroo and other gig employers have been using for a long time to disenfranchise their workforce and sort of skirt around paying us a wage we can actually live on. I mean, I'm lucky enough to be doing this job without dependents. I don't have a family. I don't have kids to feed, but many of my colleagues do. And having sort of guarantee of like minimum wage income would mean so much to them.
I want to read to you what Deliveroo have said in response to the strike. So this is a statement from their spokesperson. They say, this small self-appointed union does not represent the vast majority of riders who tell us they value the total flexibility they enjoy while working with Deliveroo alongside the ability to earn over £13 an hour. Only today, Tuesday, we ran a survey and 88% of riders said that they were happy with the company and flexibility was their priority. We are proud that rider satisfaction is at an all-time high and that thousands of people are applying to be Deliveroo riders each and every week. Riders are at the heart of our business, and today we are beginning a new consultation with riders about how we should invest our new £50 million community fund. Now, how would you respond to that particular statement? I mean, to summarize, they're saying that, look, most riders are happy with the job and you don't have much claim to represent the general workforce at large. How would you respond to that?
Well, there's a few things to unpack there. First of all, I got this email about this consultation, as every rider did. There's actually a clause in the terms and conditions where there's like a little prize draw for delivery vouchers, and you have to sign something saying that Deliveroo can use you in their PR to show how happy their workforce is, if you want to take part in that. So it's just more PR bluster and spin. I will note as well that Deliveroo until very recently said that we can make £15 an hour when it's busy. They've now dropped that to 13, and I don't know where they're getting their figures from. It's certainly not the figures that we have. I don't know where they're getting this from, but I think the core issue of this is that Deliveroo always like to claim that riders can either have flexibility or they can have rights. They can't have both. And they like to claim that by campaigning for rights, that we are going to lose the flexibility that makes this job worth doing. Now, I joined because I like the flexibility. This is a new form of flexible work. It's not an employment practice that's been around for a very long time, and it's a great opportunity for people who don't do well in other types of work. So Deliveroo know exactly what they're doing by sort of scaring riders against taking action, that if they do take action, this will be taken away. However, this is complete falsehood. They're very much on the back foot at the moment. They called us, what did they call us in that statement then?
Unrepresentative, I think. So they're calling you self-appointed. You're a small self-appointed union.
Self-appointed. Last week it was fringe organisation, which is quite amazing, really. So we've watched these statements get more and more deranged over time, but they're scared of us, and they're running scared of us because workers are starting to take notice, and workers are starting to realise that it's not a trade-off between flexibility and rights. You can have both. They're a multinational corporation. 12 investors pulled out last week, and many of them cited workers' rights concerns as a reason for them not choosing to invest in Deliveroo. Like, this is something that they are very aware of, and it's showing a change in tide, not only by us taking action, but also the general public mood towards the gig economy and gig economy workers.
That was Ethan Bradley from the IWGB. Now, Dalia, I know your PhD is on the gig economy. I want to know from you, with recent rulings that have stated that Uber has to treat its drivers as workers, not contractors, and with the problems that have now beset Deliveroo, we can see people striking, but also problems with their IPO. Do you think that maybe the tide is starting to turn when it comes to how these big tech companies treat the people working for them?
I mean, I think that's too early to say. What it does show is that and I'll go on into this a little bit later, but it does show that certainly this idea that of technological determinism, this idea that technology is kind of too all-encompassing, it is too rapidly developing for us to shape, is certainly not true. I mean, the gig economy isn't new. It's always existed in some form, especially sort of at the fringes of the economy. But the particular model that we see represented by things like Deliveroo and Uber, they are sort of a formalized, rapidly scaled up model of that gig-based exploitation, mediated through kind of the digital platform, which allows for the workforce to be sort of monitored and managed remotely by an algorithm. So that's what's different, right? And that as a model is very young. It kind of rose as a model in the early 2010s, both sort of as a response by capital to the crisis of 2008, and also because it reframed, it was framed as a sort of technologically solutionist, economically populist fix to the sort of joblessness of the post-2008 recession. And it's an economy that is characterized by these sort of moonshot companies that accrue a seemingly huge amount of power in such a short space of time, right? They have these astronomical rises, they monopolize the space very rapidly, and it can feel very overwhelming. very quickly. But it's important not to internalize that, because it's really important to not think of this model as something that is sort of infallible and cooked up in Silicon Valley and then exported top down across the world, and that's that. It's not determined. Like all models of work, it is a product of struggle, and it's still in the relatively early days of that struggle. Its shape, its contours of what it can get away with depends on the formations on the ground. One of which includes, worker power and worker organization. So the example of this strike, the IPO, the example of the Uber case in the Supreme Court, won by the ADCU, union campaigns, worker strikes, these are all having direct effects on how this emerging platform model is able to exist. And, that doesn't mean that it's easy. It's called struggle for a reason. These companies are backed by huge amounts of venture capital. They have very different pressure points and require very different strategies of organizing compared to sort of more traditional forms of workplace organizing. And I think a lot of these small grassroots unions are sort of learning on the streets. Because of the fact that, the centrality of things like data extraction, the fact that the workers are very splintered, across the city, they're not very unified physically, and the centrality of PR, the fact that company reputation and visibility, because of that venture capital component, is incredibly important to the valuation of the company, rather than sort of actual profits or actual books that are balanced, or balance sheets, as it were. So it calls for kind of different unionization strategies that are still being learned and are still being trialed. But within that context of resisting this sense of technological determinism, of this feeling that there is this new model of work that is so overwhelming, that is represented by such powerful monopolistic companies, that can't be resisted or shaped. But organizing workers and organizing the community and consumers in solidarity with those workers is absolutely essential in staving off the kind of predatory excesses of data capitalism that are most explicitly represented by this platform labor model. So, I think that these are not just important moments for worker organizing, but these are important moments in what the future of work is going to look like. And staving off these excesses at this stage is incredibly, incredibly important that they win, for all of our sake.
I mean, I think obviously too early to say was the right answer, but I think you're absolutely right that, I mean, the future of the gig economy really is now being decided by workers on the ground negotiating with these big bosses, and then public opinion and governments, etc. It does seem quite up in the air. There was a period quite recently where all of these big countries seemed completely untouchable. They could do whatever they wanted. Less so right now, and that's because of the organizing that we've been seeing today. Now, People's Momentum have had to search for a new role since the left lost Labour's leadership. Before, they were a Praetorian Guard defending the democratically elected leader against a hostile media and hostile Labour MPs. Now, out of favour with the current party leader, they need to find a new way to have a voice. And with a new coordinating group, they're aiming to use the power of their membership, not connections to the leader, to promote left-wing policies. To that end, the organisation recently balloted its members on what policies Momentum should push. And tonight, we can exclusively reveal the results. Now, we haven't sorted out the sound effects for this, so if you want drum rolls, you have to do them. You have to do them at home. And before we reveal what are the top 8 policies which Momentum's members have chosen to be the organisation's priorities over the coming years, let's get them up. Number 1 is a £15 minimum wage. Momentum will be campaigning for that over the coming years. Number 2, time for proportional representation. Number 3, global climate justice. I think we can get these up at some point. Also, building council housing and an end to homelessness. Green jobs revolution. Building back fairer. That's attacking poverty and inequality. Rejecting the integrated care system and renationalising England's NHS and social care. Now, I did check that. That's not against the principle of having an integrated care system. It's against a specific policy which involves privatisation by the back door. And number 8 is a 4-day week for which a society in which we work to live, not live to work. Now, to discuss the results and what Momentum will do with them, I'm joined by Gaia Sriskanphan. Gaia is an elected regional representative to the Momentum NCG and co-chair of Momentum. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me, Michael. It's great to be here.
Now, looking through these, you might be relieved. None of these are particularly contentious. I don't think any of these are really going to split the organisation. The one that to me seemed probably the most divisive, or where there's at least the most disagreement on the left, is proportional representation. Looking at the 8 priorities that your members have chosen, are you personally convinced these are all good ideas?
Yeah, actually, I don't know if the term is pleasantly surprised, but surprised and really, really happy to see the kinds of ideas being put forward. I think these 8 motions really represent a clear step forward from the 2019 Labour Party manifesto. There are motions that speak to people's basic economic and social needs, the housing, NHS, but there's also a future vision for a world that is green and not dominated by low-paid work, which really relates to your previous segment. And yes, I mean, I think PR is probably the one issue that some people may not be completely aligned on, but I think in terms of all the other motions that we have, that there's a lot to find agreement on. And actually, I think these really speak to issues that the broader Labour Party membership and the broader public could be able to get behind, like renationalising the NHS, which is being slowly privatised by the Tories. More public ownership is very popular. Secure housing, workers' rights, and I think COVID has really demonstrated the fractures in the system, and these motions really speak to those.
And I could go here and grill you on all 8 of these policies and find any contradictions in them. How would you pay for them, etc.? But I know that you're not, the leader of a political party. So the more relevant question is actually, what leverage do you have? How can you make a Labour leader who is quite hostile to you, to be honest, and a parliamentary Labour Party, which again is quite hostile to the left, adopt these kind of policies that you want to see? What's the plan? What's the strategy?
Well, we all know that Starmer stood on a platform of socialist policy, and we are expecting him to come back to keeping his promise and listen to what the Labour membership is saying. And of course, we're going to be mobilising our members for the conference, and there are a number of policies around which it may be able to build broad coalitions with unions and the majority of members, especially, as I mentioned, on issues on higher minimum wage, on the NHS. And of course, we all recognise there's a real risk that the leadership will continue to move further rightwards. And if this continues, then our campaign for socialist policy will draw dividing lines between those that want change and those that are content to support a rigged political and economic status quo. Currently, the Labour Party has nothing to say to a country divided and damaged by inequality and poverty and the impact of COVID-19. Not to mention the climate crisis, and it is a party that's risking fading into irrelevance. So we hope this, a show of strength at union at conference around policies that everyone can get behind might be a rallying call to the leadership.
If you're watching the show and you are enjoying it, do hit the subscribe button. We go live every Monday, Wednesday and Friday at 7 p.m. We put out videos every day. Dalia, I want to bring you in on this. I don't know if you're a Momentum member, actually, but from someone who's looking at this as a commentator, obviously there will have been, some people will be having doubts about what the Labour Party can achieve at this point. From your perspective, do you see there still being, I'm going to do the pun again, momentum on the Labour left?
I mean, I think that whether it is within the Labour Party or outside of the Labour Party, there needs to be a movement that is democratic, that is, if not membership based, at least something that has some kind of structure for which members can feel part of and invested in the project. And that sort of force will need to have a way to speak to the Labour Party in some way, shape or form, or at least a theory of change about what to do with the Labour Party, because the Labour Party is the main, I don't even want to say it's like a left wing party, but it's one of the 2 main parties in a 2-party system that isn't the Conservatives. So I think that what I'm really interested in here actually is not so much the kind of policies themselves, because ultimately those policies, we've got those kind of headline things, but what that will actually look like could be really, really progressive, or could not be so progressive. Something like the green jobs revolution, yes, but if those green jobs are, built off the backs of mining in the global south, then we'll have an issue with it, and that still needs to be hashed out. But regardless of that, what I think is really interesting here is this approach of membership-based participatory model of politics, right? It's not something that we've really had. It's something that has existed historically in many different countries throughout the world. But in terms of recent history in British politics, having a major membership-based organization in this way that is not necessarily just a trade, it's not just a trade union, but is sort of a more amorphous political organization, is something that we haven't had before, and it's something that a lot of people have been calling for. And it's something that kind of democratic policy making is something that I'm particularly interested in. And it's something that I think it's a really valiant effort to stick your head out and to try and actually do something that makes it work, do something to make it work and learn on the ground, as it were. So I think that for me, that process of membership driven policy making is really interesting, and that's kind of what I want to see more of, and what I think that other organizations should have a look and see what we can learn from that process.
Gaia, I want to bring you back in. I've got quite a basic question as my final one, which is 8 a bit too many? So when I was looking at these, I think, Momentum is a fairly small, not particularly well-resourced organization. Are you going to have the time and the energy to campaign for all of these 8, or do you think you're going to have to, prioritize the top 2 or something? I mean, how's it going to work?
I think, speaking to Dalia's point about having a broad process that's really bringing in the members and allowing them to have a say, we felt that 8 was a good amount, because it allowed an expression of what's important to the membership across a number of areas, and to sort of like make it a kind of race to the top 2, I think would drown out a lot of the content and the things that were really important to our membership. So it may seem like a lot, but a lot of these campaigns were actually, policy motions were actually submitted by Labour Party campaigns. So there are other groups and other coalitions that are also by unions. So other groups will be campaigning on these policy motions. So it won't just be us. It's not, I think that's what's so valuable about this whole process, because we're engaging our membership, but we're also engaging unions, we're engaging other campaigns, and there'll be a number of fronts through which these policy motions will be pushed.
That's a really important point. So it's not the idea that Momentum have to take sole responsibility for making all of these happen. This is often going to be Momentum now having a mandate to sort of support other movements. Gaia, thank you so much for joining us this evening. A real pleasure to have you on, and we look forward to seeing how you develop these 8 policy priorities. Yeah,
we look forward to it as well. Thanks, Michael. Bye.
Cheers. That is all for us tonight. Dalia, it's been such a pleasure being joined by you this evening. I have to say,
it's been a pleasure to be here.
I found your take on the vaccine quite so astute, I have to say. So it sort of stuck with me, actually.
Thank you. I just don't want long COVID, please.
I was very, very persuaded. Thank you for joining us this evening as well. You've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media, of course. As you know, this show is only possible because of your kind support. Thank you so much. If you are a supporter, you make this all possible. Thank you to all of our guests. For now, we're off. I'll be back on Friday at 7 p.m. You've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.